Imagine opening the refrigerator after a long day and spotting a cold can of beer tucked away in the back. Today, alcohol is everywhere: weddings, birthdays, parties, and casual nights with friends. But think back to the first time most people taste it. It is bitter, sharp, and burns on the way down. So why do humans keep drinking it? Did ancient people accidentally discover alcohol in fermented fruit, honey, and grain, or did they deliberately learn how to make it? And how did such a strange-tasting liquid become a habit that has lasted for thousands of years? It is easy to assume that alcohol was invented by clever humans sometime in the recent past. But here is the surprising part. Our ancestors' relationship with alcohol began millions of years before modern humans even existed. In ancient forests, wild yeast fed on the sugar inside ripe fruit that had fallen to the ground, naturally converting it into alcohol. As the fruit softened and fermented, it released a powerful aroma that drifted through the forest and attracted hungry animals. That idea led scientists to a theory with an almost ridiculous name: the drunken monkey hypothesis. In dense forests where thick vegetation blocked the view, the smell of alcohol may have acted like an invisible compass, guiding our primate ancestors toward fermenting fruit from far away. Those fruits were packed with sugar and energy, making them especially valuable when other food was scarce. Sometimes, a pile of slightly boozy fruit was more than a meal. It was a lifeline. Around 10 million years ago, Earth's climate became cooler and drier, causing many forests to shrink. Our ancestors could no longer depend entirely on the safety of the treetops. They had to spend more time on the ground searching for food. With fewer fresh fruits hanging overhead, they began eating fallen fruit that had already softened, broken apart, and started fermenting beneath layers of decaying leaves. That change in diet brought them closer to naturally occurring alcohol than ever before. But here was the problem. Eating fermented fruit on the forest floor was a dangerous gamble. Too much alcohol could ruin an animal's balance, slow its reflexes, and make it drowsy. A drunken primate passed out on the ground was basically a meal delivered straight to saber-toothed cats and other predators. To take advantage of this rich source of energy without becoming someone else's dinner, the body needed a way to process alcohol quickly. Then, just as survival hung in the balance, a tiny genetic change created an enormous advantage. An enzyme called ADH4, active in the mouth, esophagus, and stomach, began breaking down alcohol as soon as it entered the body. This mutation made alcohol processing roughly 40 times more efficient than in primates that remained mostly in the trees. It was a genuine evolutionary superpower, just without the cape or dramatic special effects. With ADH4 acting as a protective shield, our ancestors could eat more fermented fruit while staying alert enough to escape danger. Other primates may have avoided the same food because of the risk of intoxication, but our ancestors gained access to a valuable energy source with very little competition. Over countless generations, that mutation was passed down, becoming part of the reason humans today are able to metabolize alcoholic drinks. And that was only part of the story. Around 15 million years ago, our ancestors also lost a gene called uricase. This caused uric acid levels to rise, helping the body convert sugar and alcohol from fermented fruit into stored fat more efficiently. During droughts and periods of hunger, that extra fat acted like a biological backup battery, keeping our ancestors alive until food became available again. Together, efficient alcohol metabolism and rapid fat storage became part of what scientists sometimes call thrifty genes. In the ancient world, these traits were powerful survival tools. But in a modern world overflowing with food and highly concentrated alcohol, the same mechanisms may contribute to obesity and persistent alcohol cravings. An instinct that once helped our ancestors hunt for precious calories can now lure us into a trap one packaged in attractive bottles and cans. So who started this entire story? Not humans, but wild yeast cells so tiny that they are invisible to the naked eye. They have floated through the air and lived on fruit since long before our species appeared. The most famous is Saccharomyces cerevisiae, the same yeast commonly used to make bread. In low-oxygen environments, it consumes sugar and releases alcohol and carbon dioxide. In other words, millions of years before humans learned to brew anything, yeast had already mastered the process. But yeast did not invent alcohol to make humans happy. It was fighting a remarkably clever war for survival. When yeast finds itself surrounded by sugar, it can trigger what scientists call the Crabtree effect, rapidly converting that sugar into alcohol even when oxygen is still available. Alcohol acts like a natural disinfectant, killing or weakening many competing microbes. One by one, the competition drops away, while the yeast calmly keeps eating. A surprisingly ruthless strategy for a creature made of a single cell. For millions of years, our ancestors simply gathered fermented fruit wherever nature happened to provide it. Then they learned how to make containers. Hollows in stone, wooden troughs, and bamboo tubes began collecting fruit juice and honey. And here is where things got strange. Leave that sugary liquid alone long enough, and wild yeast from the air would settle into it, consume the sugar, and produce alcohol. When ancient people returned and tasted it, they discovered that the liquid had not only changed flavor, it also made the world feel slightly lighter. The oldest known evidence of humans deliberately making beer was discovered at Raqefet Cave in Israel and dates back roughly 13,000 years. The surprising part is that this happened before full-scale agriculture had even begun. The people living there crushed wild grains inside stone mortars, soaked them in water, and allowed natural yeast to begin fermentation. Their beer was nothing like the clear, cold, foamy drink we know today. It was thick, grainy, slightly sour, and probably looked more like a bowl of fermented porridge. That discovery revived a question researchers have debated for decades. Which came first, bread or beer? Growing, harvesting, and grinding wild grain required an enormous amount of work, while producing relatively little food. Going through all that trouble for a bland piece of bread does not sound especially exciting. But if the reward was a large batch of beer for festivals and communal gatherings, the effort suddenly makes more sense. Perhaps humans settled down not only because they were hungry, but because they wanted to throw a party. And that is only part of the story. At Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, an ancient ceremonial site more than 11,000 years old, archaeologists uncovered enormous limestone basins capable of holding around 160 liters of liquid. Traces of calcium oxalate were found on their surfaces, a compound that can form when grain is soaked and fermented. That discovery raised an intriguing possibility. Were these massive stone monuments built not only through human effort, but also with the help of very large quantities of beer? Think about that for a second. How do you persuade hundreds of people from unfamiliar tribes to work together and drag stones weighing tens of tons? Roasted meat and beer may have been part of the answer. These work feasts could reduce suspicion, create a sense of unity, and transform exhausting labor into a shared social event. The altered state produced by drinking may also have been interpreted as a way of connecting with gods or ancestors. Beer was both a reward and a kind of social glue. Now let us leave the Middle East and travel east to the ancient village of Jiahu in China around 9,000 years ago. There, tiny pores inside fragments of pottery preserved chemical traces of a deliberately brewed alcoholic drink. The people of Jiahu mixed rice, honey, and either hawthorn fruit or wild grapes, then allowed the mixture to ferment. The result was a bubbling type of ancient grog, combining the sweetness of honey, the tartness of wild fruit, and the soft aroma of rice. A prehistoric cocktail, long before anyone thought of adding a tiny umbrella. But why did they choose hawthorn fruit? Sugar was only part of the reason. Its skin often carries abundant wild yeast, making the fruit a natural starter for fermentation. Crush it, mix it with rice and honey, and those microscopic workers begin doing the rest. A lightly alcoholic drink may also have carried fewer risks than some contaminated water sources, because preparation and fermentation could reduce certain harmful microorganisms. Alcohol was not merely about celebration, it was also connected to how early societies processed food and drink. Ancient Chinese brewers eventually developed an even more sophisticated technique: fermentation starters made with cultivated molds. Rice contains a great deal of energy, but ordinary yeast cannot feed directly on starch. Mold solves that problem by acting like a pair of biological scissors, breaking long starch molecules into simpler sugars. Yeast can then consume those sugars and produce alcohol. By combining two different groups of microorganisms, brewers could create stronger rice-based drinks and established the foundation of East Asian fermentation traditions that would continue for thousands of years. While people in Asia were experimenting with rice, honey, and fruit, communities in the region of modern-day Georgia were focusing on a different crop around 8,000 years ago: grapes. Ancient pottery fragments found there contained traces of tartaric acid, a chemical marker strongly associated with grapes. People crushed ripe fruit, poured the juice and skins into large vessels, and allowed the mixture to ferment naturally. Some containers were buried underground, helping maintain a stable temperature. Inside those silent clay jars beneath the earth, one of the world's oldest wine traditions was beginning to take shape. From those clay vessels buried beneath the soil of Georgia, wine began spreading across the Middle East and the Mediterranean. But here is where it became more than a drink. Wealthy families competed to own imported wines, beautifully crafted jars, and rare varieties of grapes. Wine gradually became a symbol of status, wealth, and political power. In other words, ancient societies turned fermented grape juice into a way of announcing that someone mattered. One of the most dramatic examples was discovered inside the tomb of King Scorpion I in Egypt, dating back roughly 5,150 years. Archaeologists found nearly 700 wine jars that had once held a combined total of around 40,500 liters. The strange part was that Egypt was not yet a major wine-producing region. Analysis of the clay suggested that the jars had traveled hundreds of kilometers from the Jordan Valley by donkey and boat. Apparently, the king had no intention of entering the afterlife thirsty, but those jars contained an even more surprising secret. Chemical traces showed that the wine had been mixed with mint, coriander, pine resin, and several other herbs. The Egyptians were not using wine only for celebrations. Alcohol also worked as a solvent, drawing useful compounds out of leaves, roots, and plant resins while helping preserve them. Wine became an early form of liquid medicine. The same jar could belong on a banquet table one day and in a healer's workshop the next. Around 5,000 years ago, beer production at Abydos entered an entirely new era. Instead of a few households fermenting grain in small containers, the Egyptians constructed a large brewing complex made up of 8 long buildings containing roughly 320 massive clay vats. A single production cycle may have yielded more than 20,000 liters of beer. Think about that for a second. This was no longer a handful of people experimenting with soggy grain. It was industrial-scale production in the ancient world. So where did all that beer go? Some was probably used in ceremonies, but much of it also became part of workers' daily rations. Laborers involved in major construction projects, including pyramid complexes, may have received around 1 or 2 liters of beer each day. It provided calories, protein, and certain nutrients from grain, while its preparation could also reduce some of the dangers associated with contaminated water. Being paid in beer may sound unusual today, but to an Egyptian worker, it was almost like receiving bread in liquid form. Alcohol was not limited to the Old World. Across the ocean, communities in the Americas independently discovered how to ferment drinks from an entirely different collection of ingredients. No barley? No Mediterranean vineyards? No problem. They used corn, the sweet pulp surrounding cacao beans, and the sugary sap of agave plants. Humans, after all, are remarkably good at looking at something sweet and asking, what happens if we leave this in a container for a few days? A surprising number of inventions seem to begin that way. High in the Andes, the Inca produced a corn beer known as chicha. But there was a problem. Yeast cannot directly consume the tough starch locked inside corn kernels. Their solution sounds almost unbelievable. Brewers chewed the corn and then spat the softened mixture into a pot. Amylase enzymes in saliva began breaking the starch into simpler sugars, which yeast could then ferment into alcohol. It may not sound like the most appealing modern recipe, but biologically, it worked extremely well. Then the story takes an even stranger turn. The ancestor of modern corn was a wild grass called teosinte, which produced tiny ears with very few kernels. Why would ancient people spend generations cultivating such an unimpressive plant? Some researchers suggest that they may originally have valued its sweet stalks, which could be crushed for juice and fermented into alcohol. Over thousands of years, people repeatedly planted seeds from the most useful plants, gradually transforming teosinte into corn with large, grain-filled ears. One of the world's most important food crops may have begun, at least partly, with the desire to make a drink. On the highlands of Mexico, the Aztecs favored pulque, a cloudy, thick drink made from the sugary sap of mature agave plants. The sap was collected in containers and fermented by naturally occurring yeasts and bacteria. But pulque was not simply an everyday drink for anyone who wanted it. It was associated with the goddess Mayahuel and was often reserved for elders, priests, and special ceremonies. To the Aztecs, intoxication was not merely a chemical reaction. Under the right circumstances, it could open a doorway to the world of gods and spirits. From a piece of ripe fruit falling onto a forest floor millions of years ago to a cold can of beer sitting in a refrigerator today, alcohol has traveled beside humanity for longer than written language has existed. It helped our ancestors locate valuable energy, encouraged people to build containers, cultivate crops, hold festivals, and create stronger communities. The ancient ADH4 mutation still remains inside our bodies, carrying a distant memory of that evolutionary past. So the next time you see people raising their glasses at a celebration, remember this. It is not merely a modern custom. It is the echo of a ritual that began thousands of years ago.